All right. Since we are talking about public space and art, we thought that we would rather prefer to be all together here in this discussion. I will try to make a very brief introduction because I really would like to give as much space as possible to Mustapha and Lars that will talk about specific projects and their specific practice and how this is confronting public spaces. But in fact, before doing that, I would like just to try to talk about this very now complex nature of contemporary public spaces. I think historically, when we think about public spaces, it always comes into our minds a space in which a collectivity is represented and political rights are described. But I think more recently, more and more, the nature of the public space, it became very problematic. And more appear clear that is not always in the interest of all, especially in society in which the idea of state and nations are somehow put into question. And this is why today what you like to try to do is exactly try to understand how, when artists decide to actually work in public spaces, first of all, understanding in this interaction what is this nature of this public space, but also what is then the possibility of an artist actually to be to engage into the public. And more this public appear in different geographical contexts and different ways, but appear, of course, obsessed with security and control, and acquire this paradoxical situation in which, and we saw that, of course, during the protest, in which the idea of gathering in itself was problematic in public spaces. So if the nature of the public space should be actually the place in which people could gather and could express themselves, freedom of speech, actually through the protest, I think we really realized that are not the place. And this was, I think, made clear in Tahrir Square, for example. It was the moment in which, in the Arab world, maybe for the first time, the idea of the public was really turned against itself. It became what I would like to call more the idea of a common, so what actually people had in common. And this was a moment in which people start really to finally make the difference and confronting a political regime. So, and that's, I think, in the Arab world, I think the notion of the public, in fact, has always been very problematic because has always been kind of representing a regime that actually was not, was confronting an idea of collectivity. So, and I think in another way, and this is where also I think Lars will try to talk about his work in the context of the West. I think we saw in a kind of different way, again, this very problematic nature of public space, in which more and more, not only we have, in the last decades or two, a huge wave or let's say privatization of space, but also we understood, for example, that in order actually to create a space in which people can assemble, I think this would be impossible today in the over-regulated spaces of our cities here in Europe and the Western society. And I think one, again, example is Occupy Wall Street, in fact, that people were trying actually to assemble in different public spaces, but this, of course, was impossible because, public spaces are somehow very well regulated and controlled by the authority. And strangely enough, the only possibility for people actually to assemble was this ambiguous space between the private and the common. And was in fact found in Zuccotti Park is only because there is a regulation in New York that actually allowed people to build more floors and then giving the ground floor for the use of the public. So paradoxically, in this sense, the police was prevented actually to enter as it was a public space because of this strange private public nature. And again, these are all kind of examples in which I think it's important that we start really to try to understand how we can really rethink the idea of public spaces and really try to understand how a work of an artist could actually engage in trying to redefine these spaces and trying also to redefine an idea. And today I think we discussed a lot about the idea of a community, right? And try to understand if there is something in common that we still have. So without maybe, because what I would like to do is then giving space to Mustapha and then to Lars and somehow try to respond to their presentations and opening up the discussion as soon as possible. And I think what we'll try to do is through their work, trying to understand how in some way in Algeria and then in Europe, I think this very problematic nature of contemporary public space needs to be actually resolved. So, Mustapha, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Alessandro. Hello. My name is Mustapha Benfodil. I'm a big child of 44 years old. And I'm a writer. I write novels, poetry, theater. And my masterpiece is called Layla. But Layla is not a book. It's my daughter. And she's 6, so... As Alessandro said, I'll tell you something about artistic landscape in Algeria and how it deals with our issue. As you know, for people who knows something about the Algerian history, this year we are celebrating the 15th anniversary of our independence. And Algerian people are used to say that Algeria is independent, but Algerian citizens are not free. What I can say in the beginning is that the public space in Algeria is still a spatial fiction. It is under construction, under control, something to be reinvented. And so we cannot understand the artistic interventions in the public space if we have not a background about the social and political events who has structured this space. And if you follow the Algerian actuality, especially in the last years, you know that we have been under a very violent storm, what we call the civil war in the 90s. And what I observe is that Algerian people are still haunted by this story. So in 1992, our president, Mohamed Boudiaf, has been assassinated. And many Algerian people have seen this act on live on the TV channels. And it was big trauma. And after this, we had more than 100,000 victims, and among them there were many artists and intellectuals. Tahar Jawad, for example, he's a poet. Sheb Hasni is a singer, columnist Said Maqbel. For Alula, the man who has killed him said, it's by killing Abdel Qadir Alula, who is playwright, it's better than to kill 10,000 soldiers. So when you have this background, you understand that it's not easy for artists in such conjuncture to produce. Algiers, my city, is just a battlefield, and until now, these effects remain. For example, everywhere you have checkpoints, everywhere you have boundaries, imaginary or real boundaries, and for artists, they need for any intervention, they need to have a password. This password is authorization. So for anything, you are confronted to the authorities who ask you an authorization. For example, my wife, who is an artist Amina Menia, tried to make a a project about the subway of Algiers. We have, it has been inaugurated a year ago, and she has been confronted to authorization. And she tried to make another project in the Botanic Garden of Algiers, which is one of the best gardens in the world. For example, the movie Tarzan has been shot in 1932 in this garden. The director of the garden told her she needs authorization from above, from the Ministry of Culture or from Ministry of Home Affairs. This is dramatical because when even Ministry of Culture has no power, and for some interventions they need even military authorities. And myself, when I work in Algiers, I remember these words of the architect Fernand Pouillant, who worked in Algiers. He was saying, "Cité livide, rue caserne." It means that the streets of Algiers were like, I don't know, the word barracks or military quarters. So we have civilian quarters, but with military restrictions. This introduction is just to say that as I said, I think there is a little problem. We cannot separate the artistic field from the citizenship, from the political sphere. One of the more spectacular affairs, I think, yes, Mohammed Benchikou has wrote a book about our dear president. The title is Bouteflika, an Algerian impostor. And after publishing his book, the police has seized the book violently in the bookshops and everywhere. And Benchikou has been jailed for 2 years. And after this, he has published another book about his years in prison. The title was The Jails of Algiers, and the Ministry of Culture has banned the book in the Algerian International Book Fair and everywhere. And this is not the lowly affair. Many writers, like Boualem Sansal, like Salim Bashi, and myself, I have a book about a cartooner in Algiers, a famous cartooner. We have been banned in the Algerian International Book Fair. And the Algiers International Book Fair is the most important literature space. So many writers feel that it's not their space. After this, there was also other writers who has been persecuted by the police. One of them is called Mehdi al-Jazairi. He has wrote a novel called Poutakhin in 2009, and the policemen come and seized his computers at home. I will not be long, but I will say a few words about theater. It is my field, and I feel like a fiction myself in my country because I've bought 15 plays and no one is played in Algeria. And I'm not there are other authors which are in the same situations. We are, for example, Aziz Chouaki, Maysabe, Al-Sqimlal, Hajar Bali. These are famous playwrights who has produced abroad, but Algerian people has never been able to see their works. For this reason, I decided in 2009, during the Pan-African Festival, it was a very big event, I decided to occupy the street and to occupy this space specially. And I started a cycle of works. This is some of my works, but this plays all of them are played abroad, but none of them is shown in Algiers. So after this, in 2009, I started a cycle called Wild Readings, Lecture Sauvage. The concept was very simple. So I take any place, a garden, a parking, any area, and I start to read. Or sometimes there are actors with me, sometimes I alone. I have no special scenography. These are some of them. This was in the parking in Algiers, for example. So, but every time the police come and arrested me because they think that it could disturb the public order. And one of these readings has turned into a riot. And it was like an honor for me that people expressed their solidarity with me. It was in October 2009. And it was the first time in Algiers that we see riots for an artist. It was, as I said, we were under emergency law for 20 years, so any demonstration is forbidden in Algiers. And it was the first time people see riots in Algiers. And after this, many people were calling me from all Algeria to come and to read and to make my show. And it was, for me, a fantastic thing, because for the first time, I felt that I was linked to my society. I'll finish just by information. Yes, just a thing. After Wild Readings, I've created with 3 other authors a protest group called Bezzaf. Bezzaf, it means in Arabic, that's enough. And our first action was dedicated to the Algiers International Book Fair, and we have created a parody of a literary prize to award authors of censorship. I'll just give you this information. In this time, there is a human rights activist in Algeria. Yes, I was talking about riots. This picture refers for this riots during this Wild Readings in Algiers. So there is a human rights activist, Yassin Zaid, who has been arrested 1 week after his reading on 1st October, and he has been condemned to 6 months of jail just because he tried to create a trade union in the petroleum area in Algeria. The city is called Hassi Massoud. It's the biggest petroleum area, and maybe you will be impressed by this, but in my country, we have not the right to go to Hassi Massoud or other petroleum cities without authorization. So Yassin Zaid, he tried to create a trade union, but the policeman has arrested him, and now he has been released, but there was a great mobilization with him, but he's still condemned by justice. And I am now writing a play not about this affair, but about this matter, and I hope that it will be played someday in Hassi Massoud. Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's really interesting to listen to all of you, and I think it's also interesting since I think I'm the only Norwegian artist here, and I think I will use that opportunity to try to reflect critically a little bit about Norway as well. I mean, Norway is famous for peace prizes and conferences like this and so on, which is great. But sometimes it can also be a free ticket for us to forget to think critically about ourselves. So I've been kind of curious also as an artist to try to adopt some of the especially German attitude within the art field, because the German artists, they have, after the Second World War, really projected critics to their own nation as some kind of nation building. Whereas in Norway, nation building has been everything else than critics. It's more, let's have a nice time, let's enjoy ourselves, let's enjoy the money, let's enjoy the nature. Don't talk about negative things. So I would like to talk about the negative things. I think it's a very important role as an artist also to take up things which are kind of slightly itchy. This is, for some of you who are Norwegians, a famous place. It's called Vemork. It's a hydro power plant in Telemark. And this was part of a very famous story after or during the Second World War, when we were occupied by the Germans. It was creating or manufacturing heavy water, which was very important for the German manufacturing of the A-bomb. Therefore, the Germans tapped this heavy water and wanted to send it to Berlin. And there was this famous sabotage story of 10 Norwegians who went in there and bombed the whole shit up in the air. So there was no transport, and therefore also no German A-bomb. This became a very big story, and I heard this all my life. My whole childhood was full of like us being the heroes, because it was of course us. It wasn't the 10 people who did it. It was we. We stopped the Germans from the A-bomb, and we saved kind of the world from the Nazis. And this became a famous film, and the real heroes actually played themselves. They were very bad actors. So after a while, Hollywood realized this is a great plot. Let's go there and remake the whole thing with Kirk Douglas in the main role and so on. So they remade the whole story, Heroes of Telemark. And this, of course, boosted the Norwegian consciousness, this kind of confidence even more. So this is kind of like my, this really shaped my idea of being Norwegian. And of course, the Germans, they're always the bad guys. So that's kind of easy. And then I was invited in 1997 to a big exhibition in Germany, in Zeche Zollverein in Essen. This is a famous plant created by Bauhaus. It was the world's biggest plant for coal energy. And it's now turned into a culture center, and Norway and Germany should make a big exhibition there. The Queen should come and open it, and it was sponsored by oil companies from Germany and Norway. And I was told to do something outside there on this lawn in the middle. And I asked, is there a budget? It's like, just make something great. And is there a limitation? No, just make fantastic things. Like, show that Norway and Germany are now friends. And I thought, that's great. So I came up with the idea of, give them this heavy water, which they didn't get from that power plant. Like 50 years later, like, hey, you forgot something. It's like, we want to give you this water because we really trust you now. So I also did research and found out there are still some liters of that water in a Norwegian nuclear kind of research plant. We don't have nuclear. And I wanted to take 10 liters down there and make a big kind of swimming pool, kind of LA, Hollywood swimming pool, and just a little ball of water inside that pool again. And this turned out to become a really big problem. The government started to break it down, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs tried to break it down, and I applied to a higher court. And the good thing about Norway is it's very polite, so you just have to apply again, higher up and higher up. And finally this ended in the government. And the government had to deal with this, if this was like a security risk to the nation of Norway, and they meet once a week, the king and the government, and they discuss this, like, is this a threat? And they came up with the idea, yes, it is. So we don't trust the Germans, But this was supposed to be part of like a friendship thing, so I was like, this is a, bilateral, blah, blah, blah. This is, we trust the Germans, and this was very difficult. And then the government called this oil company and said, what the hell are you doing? Like, inviting this artist, like, this wasn't the plan. So the oil companies kind of got stressed too. But then I said, no problem, we just make water in a bowl, and we just say it's heavy water. It's like, I'm a conceptual artist, so it doesn't have, you don't have to drink it. It's not nuclear. It's just water. So let's just build it, and we say it's heavy water, and we tell the story that we are friends and so on. So okay, and then they said that it was too heavy. The whole pool is too heavy for that lawn, and I said, no, it's not heavy. I found some engineers, they said it's not heavy. So they said, okay. And then it was supposed to be built, and it was never built. And I came there to the opening, and I met the queen, and she said, where's your work? And she said, I said, there's no work. They never built it. And the normal reaction then is, of course, an artist gets pissed and drunk and goes home and says, shit, fuck you. Then I went to a lawyer saying, what should I do now? And he said, like, these cases reminds me why I wanted to become a lawyer in the first place. And I said, I have no money. And he said, let's just do it. Let's sue them. Let's sue them for Entartet Kunst, which is a big thing in Germany. That's like, the worst thing you could do, to censor art in Germany. That's why I actually love Germany. Because they did all the mistakes, they are so aware they never do it again. And then, of course, the press and the whole thing, took off. And even here, people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they stated that, using heavy water as an artist material is not good anyway, because it's not a good artist material. And people started to ask, how do you know? How can a minister say what's good for as an artist material? Anyway, this whole media thing was actually becoming a narrative, which became the story itself. That became, the project in itself, which was maybe even better than this little installation. And also in Germany, this was a big discussion. So I was invited, as a result of that, to Germany on a residency program in '98, and I started then to do research on a famous building called Palast der Republik, which was the DDR parliament. And since 1990, it had been empty because DDR didn't exist anymore. And the question was then what to do with this building. And this building was, in a way, very unwanted. And this building was really banned because DDR is over, we want to get rid of it. And before the Second World War, there was a palace here, the Palace of Kaiser Wilhelm. So people wanted to erase this building and build up the castle. But it was difficult politically and technically to do it. So the building was standing there for more than 16 years, which was 2 years longer than it had existed as a parliament. So I just followed this kind of very interesting debate and the whole kind of pro and contra discourse. Why and why not? And which part of German history do we want to protect and which part do we want to erase? And I realized this debate was so interesting, and it was going on for 16 years, which is truly democratic. I mean, that's not really tradition in Germany. They have a tradition of being totalitarian. So I was like, wow, this is something new. And during the process, they also took out the whole building from the inside because they realized it's asbestos inside. So they had to kind of demolish it slowly. And in the end, the kind of question was, do you want to keep a building looking like that? Look, it's so ugly. I mean, let's take it down. It's ugly. So more and more, it became clear to me that this whole lack of consensus, what to do with it, was worth a kind of another layer. And I applied, and I worked for 6.5 years to realize my Palace of Doubt, or Palast des Zweifels, which was finally realized in 2005 after being topic of the day in the German parliament 2 times, where 600 parliament members sit and discuss my art project and what this means and not. And in comparison to the Norwegian government, they actually said yes, because they really are open for that kind of critic, and they are not willing to censor artistic freedom. So we installed a huge letter sign, and I had to rent the whole building also for 6 months to avoid banners and so on. We installed it there for 6 months. which was very interesting because then the debate about the building came up again on a different level. And then after 6 months, the decision came that they wanted to take down the building anyway, which was sad. But in a way, this turned out to become a new kind of debate itself. And now, after the building is gone, it's still a lot of articles in Germany saying like, well, you know, the palace is gone, but the doubt is still there. So that's also fantastic. I have to say that, because it's so easy to laugh about the Germans. But I think when it comes to freedom of artistic expression, I think Germany is really one of the most amazing places on this planet right now. But the problem is, of course, the slowness of public space. And usually we don't have time for that. So it took, like I said, 6.5 years to do it. And usually that's also the problem with public space, that there's a slow bureaucracy, and this feels like a censorship itself. It's not intentionally censorship, but it feels like it. So that's also makes it more and more difficult. Also because public space is more and more privatized. And if we have time, I will show you another project. This was in 2005. Norway celebrated 100 years of freedom from the Swedes. But we also then wanted to kind of fire up our constitutional museum in Eidsvoll, and they wanted to have an exhibition or a piece, a permanent piece, for the jubileum about this freedom. For me, it was kind of like obvious. They wanted to celebrate the constitution, their freedom, 100 years. We all know this one. This was for the 100 years of freedom of the United States. The original is in Paris, and it was a gift from Paris, made by Norwegian copper, by the way. So I thought, yeah, we have to, you know, go back there and make a new monument. But I also went to Paris to do research on the Norwegian constitution, because it's actually a copy of the French and the American. So I thought, why should we celebrate ourselves? Because actually the whole nation building is based on them, so we should celebrate them. So I went to Paris and I found out that these toilets, you probably all know them, they are actually a result of the time when Jacques Chirac was mayor of Paris. He thought the constitution, the French constitution is kind of not, is saying it should be protecting the citizens on all levels, from the intellectual to the street level. And he said, public toilets are disgraceful in Paris or in France, and it's not unisex, it's only pissoirs for men, and it's dirty and it's ugly, and it's a disgrace for France. This is not a democracy. We want unisex toilets, self-cleaning toilets, and they should be, you know, symbolizing values of the French constitution. So I thought, this is great. And also, in the competition of Eidsvoll, it said it has to be more than one object. It has to be like audience activating, and it has to be like several. So I came up with this. And in fact, in this way, the audience is literally filling the artwork with meaning. And it's really not a joke also, because, I mean, what's more democratic? Some eat caviar, some eat sausages, but, you know, this is really basically human. We all have to do it. And the interesting thing is also that these are made by J.C. Decaux, which is now famous for also like one of the biggest partners privatizing public space. But back then, they were kind of like idealistic and trying to, you know, improve public space. So it's like they're kind of on both sides of the street, and they were functioning, but the Constitutional Museum didn't want them. So they stopped the whole competition, and there was a lot of fuss and a lot of writing, a lot of media. And even in New York, there was an article saying, like, what's happening in Norway, celebrating its centennial yet censoring its own liberty statue. So it became a big discussion, and in Swiss and in Germany, which led to this in front of the National Museum. But after having it, they decided not to have it after all. So it was kind of censored again. And then we had to take it away. So now it was like kind of 3 holes in the street. And I found out I have to sign that too. Because, that's also kind of part of the story. And then René Bloch, the curator of the Venice Biennial, came to me and asked me if I wanted to show it in Venice instead. So in a way, this is also a story about how resistance and censorship also kind of gives you the possibility to pull up. So we took them to Venice and placed them in front of the Nordic Pavilion, which was also interesting because the whole Venice Biennial is so based on these national pavilions. Although we as artists try to, get away and be like free artists, and suddenly we're like pulled back and we're representing our countries, and so what kind of freedom is that? But it was also funny. It also created a lot of fuss. The French protested and wanted it to go away because they have a pavilion next to it, and the Russians, they're over there. They came over to me and took my hand and said, like, "Thank you. This is the critics of Putin." I said, "If you say so." This is the last one I'm going to say, yeah? This is here in Norway. This is just outside here. You see the opera? And if you see to the right, you see like at least 1 tower. It's actually 4. The interesting thing is that this place we're now is where Oslo started its history. It's also where it got its name. Oslo, it means Os, it means like the kind of mountain on the side there, and Lo is where the river comes out. And in 1348, the plague, the pest, came to Oslo and kicked out all the people and killed everybody. And this is actually the first time since the plague that Oslo is coming back and returning to its origin. And it's making this huge, fantastic new city part. It's kind of like a city, like New York almost, and everything's new. Nobody talks about this history of Oslo and Norway. And then they build these towers, which are ventilating towers for a tunnel going under the city, under this opera we're sitting now. And they had a competition to decorate them artistically. I came up with this one. This is a project stressing the fact that this is actually where the plague came and killed 80% of the Norwegians, and our kind of language and our history. And I was planning to put up the kind of gene map on top of them. But then, funnily, the people who created that, the state department for artistic decoration, they didn't want it. They said it's actually quite nice with concrete, so they never built it. And it has been a big fight, and it's still going on. What's happening when you actually stress the fact that these ventilation towers are also like blowing up carbon dioxide and so on, and then you push another layer on top of kind of tragedy. This is not what Norway is used to. So that's basically a short presentation of my work. And like I said, I think it's very interesting that every time you meet this kind of resistance, you can either give up or you can step up. And I think like somebody said earlier as well, there's a space there, there's a gap in between, and this gap for me is also a very interesting material to work on. Okay, thank you.
All right, there will be many questions, but let's say that I think Lars got a little bit more time, so I will give some more time for Mustapha. One of the questions that I have, looking at public spaces from my perspective, which is from Palestine, it is how is linked to a colonial project. And in that sense, I'm wondering, looking to the history of Algeria, and the transition in between, let's say, the colonial occupation into then independence, you know, and how if at that time the public was mainly in relation to a colonial presence, and how there was this movement on trying to understand how finally people actually could be in the public spaces without being in the colonial spaces. So what are the form of reappropriation that Algerians use, and especially now looking at the transformation of public spaces in this new context of Arab revolts, no? Because I feel that in the Arab world there is still this very crucial issue in which the public historically in the recent year has been associated to colonial occupation and colonial management of space. I was wondering how, you know, historically in Algeria, but especially more recently, in a way, through your arts, or, you know, for the people around you, start to claim a different idea of the public.
What I can say, is that Algerian society is always trying to reinvent public space, and paradoxically sometimes the private space becomes public space when the government don't allow people to express themselves. I give just an example. At the independence of Algeria, we had in all the country more than 400 theater movies. Now there are still only a few. More of them, they project blockbusters and bad movies. The Ministry of Cultures give funds for some independent films, but the paradox is that he don't allow them to project what we call in Algeria visa d'exploitation. The people, for example, filmmakers, are obliged to project their movies in apartment or in private spaces. And on the other hand, you have many young filmmakers who are invited by the French Institute, and who get funds abroad by many organizations. So in the official discourse, Algeria is independent. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of independence, but our culture is produced abroad, is produced by foreign managers or foreign partners, and inside Algiers, many artists to express themselves are invited by foreign institutes, for example, Italian Institute, Spanish Institute, and in the locations dedicated to cultural events, we see that we have just official culture around big events. For example, we had the Arab Year, we had the Islamic Year, we had the Pan-African Festival, and this year we had the independence anniversary. And we just, the government just want to use artists to justify his policy and to glorify his policy. But the civil society and the artists are always inventing other spaces. What I showed about wild readings, it was just a little example, but there are many examples like this. For example, musicians have created a group called Committee for the Liberation of Culture and Citizenship, who make concerts in the street. We have independent festival. We have little companies who try to play in wild areas. But I think that the Arab uprising will have a good impact in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.